Authorities arrested the alleged Chinese drug lord nicknamed Brother Wong, a fugitive from Mexico and wanted in the United States for drug trafficking.
It was still morning in Brooklyn when a man with a long list of aliases was brought into a federal courtroom, and the headline reality landed like a hammer. A high-value target tied to the Sinaloa cartel and CJNG was now on U.S. soil, facing international narcotics and money laundering charges. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, prosecutors allege he helped run a trafficking and laundering network that operated since at least June 2016, moving thousands of kilograms of narcotics across borders, while hiding profits behind more than 100 shell companies used to wash money through the U.S. banking system. The case files describe seizures linked to the organization that include 46 kilograms of cocaine, 58 kilograms of methamphetamine, and almost 7 kilograms of fentanyl. And investigators say the shell company structure was used to launder at least $77 million in narcotics proceeds. That is the part most people never see, because the real battlefield is not always a street corner or a border fence, but a quiet pipeline of cash, accounts, and fake paperwork that keeps an empire alive. So how does ICE HSI and its partners pull a cartel-linked operator out of Mexico and into a U.S. courtroom without the network slipping away? Subscribe to Military Power because the operation behind this transfer is where the real story begins. To understand why U.S. investigators treated this suspect as more than just another extradition, we have to zoom out and see how a cartel network works when it is built like an underground corporation and not like a street crew. In the court filings, federal prosecutors describe a system that has operated since at least June 2016, moving narcotics across borders while hiding behind layers of coordinators, couriers, and paperwork that looks ordinary until you follow the money. The Sinaloa cartel's advantage has never been only violence, because its real strength is logistics. Think of it like a supply chain that can shift routes the way a military force shifts positions, using Mexico as a staging area and the United States as the market. Prosecutors say the organization imported thousands of kilograms of narcotics, which matters because thousands of kilograms is not a suitcase problem. It is a multi-ton pipeline that has to be scheduled, stored, moved, and paid for again and again without breaking. That is where the suspect's alleged role becomes the key. The government is not describing him as a local dealer or even a mid-level transporter, but as a coordinator who helped connect shipments to distribution hubs and then manage the financial return. In the New York case, law enforcement linked multiple seizures to the organization, including 46 kilograms of cocaine, 58 kilograms of methamphetamine, and almost 7 kilograms of fentanyl. And those numbers are only what authorities physically intercepted, not what successfully passed through. The fentanyl detail is especially alarming in today's reality, because fentanyl is measured in tiny amounts, yet it can produce an enormous number of potentially lethal doses once it is processed and distributed. But the darker secret is not only the drugs, it is the financing that makes the machine durable. Prosecutors say the organization used more than 100 shell companies in the United States, opened with fraudulent documents, and that those structures were used to launder at least $77 million in narcotics proceeds. In plain language, that means the cartel did not just smuggle product. It built a quiet cash highway that could move profits through banks, accounts, and transfers until dirty money looked clean enough to disappear into normal life. The process described in the filings sounds less like a movie heist and more like a disciplined operation. Workers were recruited to open accounts and pick up cash at drop locations, while supervisors in Mexico reportedly directed each step, from travel logistics to the documents needed to keep the system running. When you read it that way, the case stops being one arrest and starts looking like an attempt to cut a control cable. Because if you remove the people who coordinate payments and routing, the whole network begins to shake. This is also why the U.S. government classified the suspect as a consolidated priority organization target, which is a designation reserved for the most significant narcotics traffickers in the world. And it helps explain why, after Mexican authorities captured him in 2024, and he later escaped house arrest before being recaptured, the final transfer back to the United States became a major objective, ending with his return on October 23rd and an arraignment in Brooklyn on Wednesday, November 19th. So the background is simple, but the implications are heavy. This is not a normal case built around a single shipment, because the government is aiming at a system designed to move tons of narcotics and millions in profit over years, and that is exactly why ICE could not treat it like a routine arrest. But to reach a link at this level, the operation behind the scenes had to look more like a campaign than a raid, and that is where the real story begins. The first move in this ICE case did not happen at a border crossing or on a dark road in Mexico. It happened in places most people never picture when they hear the word cartel. Bank ledgers, corporate registrations, and the kind of digital paperwork that looks boring until it starts to repeat in the wrong way. In the official U.S. Department of Justice release, prosecutors describe a trafficking and laundering organization that began operating in Mexico at least as early as 2016, and they allege it imported thousands of kilograms of narcotics into the United States and other countries. Yet the detail that changes how you see the story is not only the drugs, because the filings say the network relied on a large support structure in the United States, including more than 100 shell companies opened with fraudulent documents, and those companies were used to move and disguise narcotics proceeds. Prosecutors say the laundering tied to this operation reached at least $77 million, which means, this was not just a smuggling problem, it was a financial system designed to survive long pressure. This is where Homeland Security Investigations, ICE's investigative arm, comes into the picture with a style that feels closer to counterintelligence than street policing. Instead of chasing only the product, investigators follow the payment, because payment has to touch the real world. Someone has to open the account, someone has to file the paperwork, and someone has to move the funds without triggering alarms. In this case, prosecutors describe an extensive network of coordinators and couriers, and they allege supervisors directed people inside the United States to complete tasks that kept the pipeline moving. Once you understand that, the operation starts to feel like a slow hunt rather than a sudden raid. Each shell company becomes a marker on a map, and each transaction becomes a line connecting cities, names, and routines. The case narrative points to a system that could route money through legitimate-looking businesses, then recycle those funds to pay for transport, storage, and the next shipment. Modern cartel finance also adapts to modern tools, and U.S. threat assessments have repeatedly highlighted that transnational criminal organizations exploit new payment methods, including digital assets, because speed and anonymity can help them outrun traditional oversight. That matters here, because even when a case centers on shell companies and bank accounts, the broader environment pushes investigators to think fast, since money can be shifted across borders in minutes while law enforcement moves in days. Still, the goal of ICE is not to make headlines with one arrest. The real objective is to break the operating chain, the system that keeps the network alive after leaders change names, change phones, and change routes. That is why cases like this are built like layered dossiers, where prosecutors stack seizures, communications, and financial links until a court can see the architecture, not just the crime. In this DOJ case, authorities cite multiple drug seizures tied to the organization, including cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl, which helped reinforce that the money trail was not abstract, but connected to real shipments moving through the system. Then timing becomes everything. A network that can generate tens of millions in clean-looking transfers can also shut down, rebrand, and rebuild if it senses pressure. So investigators keep quiet, keep watching, and keep collecting proof until the moment arrives when moving is safer than waiting. And that is the turning point for the story. Because once the file is thick enough to survive a courtroom fight, the operation stops being slow and silent. The arrest phase of this story did not feel like a single moment, because the target did not stay in one place, and he did not stay in one legal status. U.S. authorities say Zhidong Zhang, also known as Brother Wang, was first arrested in Mexico City in October 2024 at the request of the United States after U.S. prosecutors accused him of overseeing a trafficking and money laundering network operating out of Mexico since at least 2016. At that point, the case was already bigger than a normal handover because prosecutors describe a system that imported thousands of kilograms of cocaine, fentanyl, and methamphetamine into the United States and other countries. And they allege his organization laundered at least $77 million through more than 100 shell companies created with fraudulent U.S. documents. That kind of role turns a suspect into a walking hard drive, since the person who coordinates logistics and payments can reveal routes, brokers, and hidden accounts that cannot be seen from one seizure alone. Then the story took a turn that exposed the real danger of moving a high-value target across borders. According to the Associated Press, Zhang was later placed under house arrest by a judge in Mexico, and in July 2025 he escaped despite being under military guard, which immediately raised the pressure on every agency tied to the case. In cartel operations, escapes are not just embarrassing, they are operational alarms, because once a priority target breaks free, two threats appear at the same time. One is the risk of a cartel-linked extraction, where associates try to keep the person out of U.S. custody. The other is the risk of silencing, because anyone who knows the money routes and the names behind them can become a liability to their own network. What happened next shows why extradition in cartel cases is not only a legal step, but also a security mission. The AP reported that after escaping Mexico, Zhang was later recaptured in Cuba, and Mexican authorities confirmed his identity as they worked the path toward returning him. Reuters later reported that Mexico deported Zhang to the United States and that U.S. authorities were preparing to bring him into the American court system to face the charges connected to Mexican cartels. The key date is the one that ends the chase. U.S. officials and major media reporting state that Zhang was returned to the United States on October 23, 2025, and he later appeared in federal court in Brooklyn, where he pleaded not guilty and was ordered held in custody pending further proceedings. That courtroom appearance matters because it means the target is no longer protected by distance or by legal delays in another country. He is inside the U.S. system, where prosecutors can lock the case to a timeline and start applying pressure through evidence, witnesses, and financial records. This is also where the phrase multi-layer security becomes real, without needing Hollywood scenes. In cases like this, the security is built from procedure more than spectacle, because the goal is to prevent disruptions before they happen. Transfers use strict custody rules, controlled movements, and constant supervision, since the risk is not only an outside attack. The risk can be the chaos of a sudden leak, a tipped-off route, or a last-minute attempt to derail the handover. When a suspect has already escaped once, every step becomes tighter, because officials cannot afford a second disappearance. The U.S. objective is clear in the way prosecutors frame the case. They are not just trying to punish one man. They are trying to capture information that can dismantle the machine behind him, the shell companies, the financial coordinators, and the cross-border brokers who keep a cartel pipeline alive even when shipments are intercepted. But bringing the suspect into U.S. custody is not the finish line. It is the start of the most sensitive phase. Because once the target is in a U.S. courtroom, the real battle becomes what he knows, what prosecutors can prove, and how the network reacts when it realizes one of its key managers is finally within reach. When the suspect finally stood inside a U.S. federal courtroom, the atmosphere of the case changed completely. This was no longer about pursuit or transfer. It became about numbers, documents, and consequences that could not be escaped. According to charging documents released by the U.S. Department of Justice and later summarized by Reuters and the Associated Press, the indictment goes far beyond a single drug shipment or a short conspiracy. Prosecutors describe an operation accused of moving drug quantities that exceed the highest thresholds defined under U.S. federal law, placing the case among the most serious narcotics prosecutions currently on the books. At the center of the indictment is an allegation that the network coordinated the trafficking of massive volumes of cocaine, methamphetamine, and fentanyl over multiple years. Federal law sets harsh penalties once certain quantities are crossed, and in this case, prosecutors say those limits were not just exceeded, but multiplied many times over. The filing outlines a conspiracy that allegedly handled shipments measured in tons, not kilograms, a scale that automatically triggers mandatory minimum sentences and opens the door to multiple counts being stacked together. Reuters, reporting on similar cartel prosecutions, explains that this legal structure allows prosecutors to build cumulative exposure, where each charge carries its own penalty, and time does not simply merge into one sentence. The money side of the indictment is just as heavy. U.S. prosecutors allege that the organization laundered more than $1 billion in drug proceeds over several years, using shell companies, financial intermediaries, and cross-border transfers to disguise the origin of the funds. While earlier seizures tied to the case documented tens of millions of dollars, the broader indictment reflects the full-scale investigators believe moved through the system. Inside the courtroom, these numbers change how the case is viewed. A single count might lead to decades in prison, but stacked charges create a different reality. Legal analysts quoted by the Associated Press note that when narcotics conspiracy charges are combined with large-scale money laundering counts, the sentencing exposure can effectively amount to life imprisonment, even without a formal life sentence being imposed. In plain terms, a defendant may never walk free again, regardless of age or future cooperation. Yet the deeper meaning of this trial is not limited to the fate of one person. This courtroom is being used as a lens to expose how a cartel financial system works behind the scenes. Prosecutors are not only presenting drug quantities and bank transfers, but also corporate records, communications, and transaction trails that map how money moved from U.S. cities back through Mexico and into reinvestment channels. Reuters has reported that in cases like this, the courtroom becomes a place where hidden economic structures are made visible, turning abstract intelligence into public evidence. That exposure matters. Each document introduced into the record is a thread that can lead to additional investigations, seizures, and arrests. Financial networks do not collapse all at once. They unravel as accounts are frozen, companies are dissolved, and intermediaries realize their names are now part of a federal case file. From the government's perspective, this is how pressure spreads outward from a single defendant to an entire ecosystem. The seriousness of the moment is also reflected in how prosecutors frame the stakes. They're not asking the court to view this as an isolated crime, but as part of a long-running operation that fueled drug availability, overdoses, and violence across borders. By placing the case in a federal courtroom, the U.S. government is asserting jurisdiction over a global network and signaling that distance and complexity are no longer reliable shields. Still, a trial is not a conclusion. It is a test. Evidence must hold, witnesses must stand, and every claim must survive scrutiny. That is why this phase is both decisive and dangerous, because once the financial architecture of a cartel is laid out in public, the consequences ripple far beyond the walls of the courtroom, reaching into networks that are now forced to react. And that raises the next question. If this trial exposes the machinery behind billions in illicit finance, what happens when the system realizes one of its key operators is no longer silent, but sitting at the center of a federal case that could last for years? When investigators talk about this case behind closed doors, they do not describe it as a single win. They describe it as a signal. What makes this moment different is not just that a suspect tied to the Sinaloa cartel is now standing in a U.S. courtroom, but what the numbers attached to the case reveal about how the United States is changing its approach. For years, success in the drug war was measured in seizures. A few hundred kilograms of cocaine intercepted at sea, a truck stopped at the border, a warehouse cleared out after a long investigation. Those operations mattered, and they still do. But as Reuters and the Associated Press have reported in recent years, seizures alone do not dismantle global networks. They slow them down while the leadership adapts and reroutes. This case points to a different priority. Instead of focusing only on the product, U.S. agencies are now targeting the people who coordinate the flow of tens of tons of narcotics and the movement of billions of dollars. Prosecutors allege that this network handled drug volumes far beyond traditional thresholds, and that its financial arm was capable of laundering sums that rival the annual budgets of small countries. Those figures are not just shocking, they are strategic, because they show where pressure hurts the most. The message to cartel leadership is blunt. You can hide behind layers of couriers, shell companies, and intermediaries, but every shipment and every transfer leaves a trail. Eventually, the math stops working in your favor. According to DOJ statements cited by major U.S. media, investigators increasingly rely on financial analysis to identify who is actually in control, because money does not lie the way people do. Routes change, names change, phones get burned, but ledgers connect the past to the present. That shift also explains why extraditions are becoming more frequent and more aggressive. In the past, distance offered protection. Operating from another country created delays, legal barriers, and political friction. Today, those barriers are thinner. Reuters reporting shows that U.S. prosecutors are working closely with foreign partners to bring high-value targets into American courts, especially when cases involve large-scale money laundering that touches the U.S. financial system. Once money crosses into U.S. banks or companies, jurisdiction follows. This trend has consequences beyond one defendant. Each extradition sets a precedent, and each billion-dollar indictment sends a warning. It tells other networks that they are not being measured by how much product they move in 1 year, but by how much damage they cause over time. It also tells mid-level operators that anonymity is fragile. Even if you never touch a kilogram of drugs, coordinating payments can place you directly in the crosshairs. There's also a technological dimension to this shift. Financial crime units now use data analysis tools that were once reserved for national security work, tracking patterns across thousands of transactions instead of chasing individual cash drops. According to public DOJ briefings, these methods allow investigators to see cartel operations as systems, not scenes of crime. That systems view makes it harder for large organizations to hide behind complexity, because complexity itself becomes evidence. Looking ahead, the forecast is clear. More extraditions are likely, especially for suspects tied to transnational laundering networks. More indictments will cite billion-dollar figures, not as exaggeration, but as a reflection of how large these operations have become. And more cases will focus on coordinators rather than shooters, because dismantling leadership weakens the entire structure. For the Sinaloa cartel and groups like it, this case is a warning shot without gunfire. It shows that the battlefield has expanded from borders and streets into courtrooms and databases. The United States is signaling that it is no longer satisfied with catching shipments. It is hunting the people who make the shipments possible. And as those numbers continue to surface in indictments and trials, one reality becomes harder to escape. You can bury yourself under layers of middlemen, but eventually the numbers point back to the person giving the orders. By the time the courtroom doors closed, it was clear this story was never just about one arrest or one transfer across borders. What unfolded here was a strike against an underground economy, measured not in street deals, but in billions of dollars, an economy that quietly fuels violence, addiction, and instability far beyond the places where the drugs are sold. Reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press has repeatedly shown that when U.S. prosecutors bring these cases to court, they are not only counting seizures, they are exposing how entire financial systems are built to keep cartel power alive year after year. This is why the outcome matters. Removing a coordinator who managed money, flows, and logistics does more than disrupt one route. It shakes confidence inside the network. Shell companies collapse, accounts freeze, partners panic. For organizations like the Sinaloa cartel, money is not just profit. It is control, loyalty, and survival. When that flow is threatened, the structure above it starts to crack. Yet this moment also raises a harder question, one that investigators quietly ask themselves. If cartel leadership keeps losing the people who understand the numbers, who know the routes, and who manage the payments, how long can the system adapt before it begins to fracture from within? History shows that violence alone does not end these organizations, but sustained pressure on their finances can change how they operate, and sometimes whether they can operate at all. This case signals a future where battles are fought less in open streets and more in databases, courtrooms, and financial records. The operations are slower, quieter, and far more deliberate, but their impact can be just as decisive. If you want to understand how these hidden campaigns unfold and why the most important operations often happen out of sight, subscribe to Military Power, because the biggest moves in modern conflict rarely make noise when they begin.